Okay, so I want to talk today about the state power principle, or just generally state power, democracy, rule of law, etc., within debating. And I have a couple of notes just beforehand. Um, Basically, firstly, one second, let me just load the slide. Yeah. So this will firstly assume a level of familiarity, kind of generally with principled reasoning in debates, how to do principles, etc., how to run a principle, um, in the kind of basic familiar way. It will also assume that you're generally familiar with the state power principle. Um, as a side note, it's also not going to get too much into the strategic uses of each of the things that I'm going to talk about. This is mostly going to be a discussion of it kind of a little bit abstractly in the aim, with the aim that this becomes a number of extra tools in your toolbox for when you are debating and allows you to kind of find reasoning for things that you might otherwise consider. So with that in mind, most of the workshop is going to be quite selectively useful. In general, the regular formation of the state power principle will be sufficient for whatever you're attempting to do, with the exception of really particular rounds. So either sometimes when a motion is, say, for example, directly about state power, not just present as an argument within the round. Sometimes you can get into more deeper debates about the implications of these things. So debates about democracy, for example, oftentimes will have these things, or like the old Doxbridge final about the legitimacy, semi-final about the legitimacy of the state. That kind of thing will be useful there. But I'll highlight some other instances where it might be more generally useful. And also a note, just a kind of overall note before I start, is that the state power principle within debates is mimetic, which is to say that it's kind of become a thing in itself. And it's something that we see as its own thing. And there's a couple of things that means. Firstly, it means that it oftentimes doesn't get the same level of scrutiny by teams or judges that other principles would. So, for example, if I had argued in a debate, each person has a fundamental right to privacy, and by imposing CCTV cameras, the state has taken away our right to privacy. Therefore, the state must return our right to privacy in this specific way, yielded by the motion. A judge would likely say, okay, but why is privacy a right? Or why do we have to restore that right? Or even teams would argue that, well, okay, we can restore it in other ways, etc. But the state power principle doesn't get this. It hasn't evolved much in the last 4 or 5 years, except in specific circumstances. And so it exists at a level of principled reasoning, I think, a little bit behind some of the other principles in debates, where it requires a little bit less justification sometimes, and that kind of thing. This also means that I think people tend to just run it pretty verbatim. They tend to just have a version of it formulated in their head that they just run. And teams kind of like their eyes glaze over when someone's running the state power principle rather than like listening to what they're actually saying and rebutting what they're actually saying. Which leads to this weird thing where it's like, it's basically just like a black box you can throw into the middle of a debate and say democracy is good or bad or whatever. Meaning that there's a kind of weakness to how it's engaged with, which can be probably strategically useful if you're able to exploit that. But what it also means is that some of the material in this might be quite difficult, because even though say theoretically there's a lot of strong objections to the state power principle, a judge might not give them as much credit as they would a different objection to a different principle, because they're very familiar with hearing the state power principle. So they consider it to be a full and justified principle, even when it isn't actually being fully justified within a particular debate. This is not to say that this state power principle shouldn't be credited as it is run. I think it's a fully formed, fine syllogism, as I'll explain later. And you certainly like shouldn't like look at this and then think, oh, I'm going to give every team that runs the state power principle a fourth now unless they do these specific things or cover these specific premises. As you know, it's pretty clear by the judge manual, you don't have to justify everything down to like the nth degree. It's just needs to be justified to the extent that it is reasonable to justify it. I think that the existing state power principle does that. It's a reasonable principle and it justifies reasonably that democracy is a good thing. But there is ways to navigate with it in debates that can be particularly useful. So I'll actually get onto that. But basically the overall objective of this then is to kind of decalcify, I guess, the state power principle within debates and see if we can kind of maybe stir it up a little bit. Okay, so yeah, the three things I want to cover then is the general state power principle, like the regular one you see in debates, and flaws you can have with it. It's going to be covering two things there. So it's going to be firstly, thinking about how you would interact with the state power principle if someone is using it to justify something that is bad but democratic, but also if it's used to justify why something that is good shouldn't be done just because it's not democratic. Then it's going to talk about alternative formulations of the state power principle, and some other discussions of state power, generally kind of all under the headline of alternatives. So 2 and 3, they are going to be kind of meshed together, but they are kind of distinct theoretically, I guess, in the workshop. So yeah, and also as I was saying, in line with the previous workshop, this intends to demonstrate a few tactics that can be used to neutralize the state power principle within rounds. So this is the first section that we're moving on to now. And the kind of objective of this, or the kind of usefulness of this in theory, is that if you are running a case in a round that is not the state power principle, but you know that a different team will run the state power principle, could run the state power principle, or has run the state power principle in the round to dispute your argument, how can you neutralize that either in the point of information or preemptively in your case or in responses? So starting with what the state power principle actually is. In general, this is the way you tend to see it being run in debates, but slight variations, but this tends to be the kind of general one. It's premise one: the state restricts our freedoms by imposing laws that are enforced by violence, right? So if I break the law, the policeman will come to my house and break my arm. That's, I think, the way that Chin explains it in the Thailand World Semi. You know, if I take your water, the policeman will come and will break my hand. You also hear people saying, you know, oh, they'll drag you into the back of a van, put you, you know, in a small enclosed cell. Oftentimes you'll hear this being run pretty verbatim. So like from the moment you're born to the moment you die, every action you take is controlled by the state, yada, yada, yada. Premise two is we do not have the choice as to whether we live in a state. So even if we can theoretically move between states, we can't move out of states because there's no unclaimed land that we could theoretically move to where we would be free from state imposition. Actually, that's another objection I didn't consider yet. I'll get back to the later. Therefore, we should have the right to shape the nature of these laws. Therefore, democracy is an absolute right. That's the general way to see it. It's a fine principle, no problems with it. Like no fundamental intrinsic problems with it. But there's lots of objections you can have to it. So we're going to look at some of these objections now. You might not agree with all of these objections, and certainly a lot of them are more reasonable than others. But these are just all the different ways in which you can respond to this, all the different flaws you have with it. So we'll start with the first premise, which is the first set of objections is when you're arguing for something that's good but undemocratic, and you're trying to justify that perspective. So if it's like forging election results to make sure that a fascist party doesn't win, or like protection of minority rights when the majority has voted against it, or like environmental policy at the expense of existing people currently, that kind of thing. Something that you're arguing is a good thing, but a different team could say, well, that's not democratic, so we shouldn't do it. The first premise then, the state restricts our freedom by imposing laws. I think there's two ways to undermine it. Both of these are actually deontological, but the reason why I've labeled them as consequentialist and deontological is I think the first tends to work best when you're running a consequentialist case and you're responding to this charge of your case being undemocratic. It basically says that our freedom is actually informed by a bunch of different factors. So, for example, whether I have enough money to go to the hospital informs my freedom to go to the hospital. Or it could even go on the like raw utility level. Whether I'm happy on a given day is informs my freedom to get out of bed on that day. So you can go into the really fundamental level if you want. The idea of that then is that you can just reframe your utilitarian consequentialist analysis as something which also provides freedom to people as a result. So if you return to a previous example of like forging election results, for example, you could say, okay, even if we forge election results and reduce people's freedom in the here and now, in the long term, that will lead to a more prosperous society in which people are richer, wealthier, safer, etc., which are all instrumental to their freedom within that their world. This first objection, I think I first heard being run by actually also by Chin in a round that I cannot remember, but I think he was in Upwhip in that round. So basically, you can just say, well, look, our argument explains why you get more freedom in general. And because your formulation of the state power principle hasn't explained anything other than freedom is a good thing and we need to maximize freedom, we're restoring this freedom to people in other ways that aren't the vote. The vote is not a unique way of providing this freedom. We're going to give them more freedom by doing our thing, and our thing is better because, and then you just weigh, right? You weigh on freedom as a corollary of your utilitarian analysis. Second objection is more deontological, or rather, it works well when you're running a deontological case, or if you're running an alternative state power principle on your side of the house that just disagrees on the particulars. It basically says that our freedom is informed by our ability to rely on the actions of other people, right? So me being able to walk down the street is premised on whether I can rely on not being attacked by other people on the street. So, and you can also say it's about solving collective action problems, which makes us more free. But this kind of reliance on others is the ability to be more free by being all restricted. So applying equal restrictions to all people allows everyone to be more free than they would be when they didn't have that restriction. It's a specific case, but it can be quite useful. This is actually, we'll get to this in more detail later. This is I think Rousseau's argument in favor of democracy, right? It forces people to be free, or at least is my interpretation of Rousseau's argument for democracy. I wrote an essay on it once. So yeah, basically the implication of both of these things is that it rejects the first premise of the state power principle, that the laws don't necessarily restrict our freedom. And given that the conclusion of the state power principle relies on us being owed freedom, because they took freedom away from us and must give it back, if you have shown that your freedom wasn't in fact taken away in the first place, then the reparative obligation that the state power principle is reliant on doesn't actually manifest, doesn't follow. And so it's the same as, for example, if you give a shopkeeper $2 for a chocolate bar, they don't owe you $2 back because they've already given you your chocolate bar. They've already fulfilled the transactional obligation that existed within that dynamic. And so the state power principle in this instance wouldn't follow. The second premise then, which you could object to in the same way, we don't have a choice as to whether or not we live in a state. There's two potential objections here, really straightforwardly. Firstly, if we had the choice, would it matter? I don't think any reasonable person, you could argue, would choose to live outside of a state apparatus, if life is nasty, brutish, and short, because it would be complete hell. It would be completely awful. This is where I'll actually add in one of the other things, which is I think you actually could argue that there is the ability to live outside the state apparatus, because there's some places in the world that the rule of law doesn't actually really exist. So as far as I know, I think at the moment, some parts of, for example, Somalia, there's not like proper rule of law implemented by the government. In completely rural areas, you could argue this isn't the case. Like if you moved to, the mountains in Appalachia, the government is really kind of, even if it might be theoretically in control of you, it isn't literally in control of you. Remote islands where nobody lives, that aren't claimed by a particular state. You could argue that those are actually like not even hypothetical, but are real options that just no one takes. But the more important thing is that hypothetically, even if you did have the option to choose these things, you would never choose those options. So this is called hypothetical consent. Even if you haven't been actually given the option, if you were to have been given the option, you would always choose option A and not option B. So it doesn't matter whether option B was ever actually presented to you. The second thing then is, I think, a more interesting one, which has worked for me in the past, but I think might be judge dependent, which is you could just say that we do have the option to live outside a state because we could vote in anarchist parties who would dismantle the state apparatus and would leave us without a state. And the fact that we haven't done this is just because we don't want to do this. It's a form of explicit consent, therefore, in those instances. The first debaters I heard using this was, I think, Ron and Joseph, like Ron Lesrovich and Joseph Lewis. I think I heard run this one before. What's really fun about this objection is that the intuitive response that they would want to give to it is like, oh, but that's only, you need every other person to vote alongside you to bring in an anarchist party in order for this to work. And then you could say, aha, so voting doesn't actually bring democracy because the same kind of process occurs. We'll get to that in more detail later. But it's basically a pretty nice way of responding to it, because the intuitive response to that objection is something that they cannot hold alongside holding the arguments of the state power principle. So they need to search for some really difficult responses in order to justify their thing, the principle, in light of this objection. Both of these objections basically imply that coercion under the law is legitimate because we do really have the option to just not be subjected to those set of laws. or if we did have the option, we wouldn't take it. So we've consented to these laws, even if we haven't voted for specific laws. We've consented to being in that place that has brought in those laws, because we could hypothetically not be in that place, either philosophically or geographically. And so it actually doesn't make sense there. And a good intuition point for this is the question: would you convict a 17-year-old of murder if it was completely proven that they did it? And if someone says yes, which they should, probably, that demonstrates that we can be subject to laws that we haven't literally consented to, because that person hasn't voted on murder yet. They haven't had the choice to start a party or to vote for politicians who would legalize murder. But they nonetheless should still be subject to the laws related to murder, you could certainly argue, which means that the kind of basis of this objection holds water, which is that even if we haven't consented to the specific law, that doesn't necessarily mean that that law is illegitimate. Okay. You can also argue problems with the conclusion of the argument, because it is poorly supported by the premises of the actual argument. There's two reasons for this. The first is the argument just presumes that reciprocity is an absolute moral imperative without defending that position. Because the idea of the argument is that freedom has been taken away from you, so it must be restored to you. But rarely do teams actually justify why X being taken away from group A means that X must be returned to group A and not given to group Y, who is more needy, or just distributed in general. There's a couple of different ways you could do this objection. The first would just be to use it to kind of cast doubt on the principle in general, to say it's poorly formulated. But you can also twist it into something that's better for you. So you can either reject the conception that reciprocity is an absolute imperative or even a good thing at all, and just say that freedom should be distributed evenly, across all people, or distributed, which might not work with your objection to the principle, right? Because that might still imply democracy, or should be given to the person who needs it most, right? You can just say that need is the most important moral metric. You look at the people who have the least amount of freedom and give this freedom to them. This could be used, for example, to justify minority rights within democracies, even when those rights have been explicitly voted against by the majority. Or specific rights to do with freedom in general could be kind of good here. But basically the idea there is that there's no real proof that, this transactional kind of reciprocal moral kind of status is the more important one. You can justify that. Like if the police, if someone steals your television, the police will take it and give it back to you and not a random person. I think that's from a different workshop on principles. But you would need to justify it. And if it hasn't been justified, the subjection should hold water. The second rejection then is the argument just presumes that freedom is some kind of good without explaining why it's the case, right? Or, like it's if something it doesn't matter at all, then it doesn't matter if it's taken from you. It doesn't matter whether it's given back to you. If there's no moral status to freedom, then it doesn't matter whether freedom is taken away from you. And so there's kind of two ways in which you could use this objection to kind of cast out the principle. The first would be you could just argue that free will doesn't exist. If you look at a lot of the kind of, it's interesting because agency is kind of coming back into the meta pretty heavily. But if you look a few years ago at MDG speeches, he would oftentimes just respond to agency-based arguments by saying, here's some reasons why free will doesn't exist. So your agency principle doesn't matter. And this kind of really simplistic, straightforward, almost kind of brutish response to the principle, right? Where it's like, well, it just doesn't matter because free will doesn't matter. So all of your complex philosophical analysis can get into the bin. Does work, like philosophically that tracks. If freedom doesn't exist, then then there is nothing that has been taken away from you. So there is nothing that ought to be restored to you. Another way in which you could do this is, even if you think that freedom exists, you just might not think it's morally important. And if you were running, for example, utilitarianism, you could just say that utilitarianism is the important thing. Freedom doesn't matter, but happiness matters. The only reason we think that freedom matters is because freedom generally allows us to choose options that lead to more happiness. But in this instance, it doesn't. So we can have our case and eat it too. That's one way you would argue it there. You oftentimes hear people, and this is just a side note, you oftentimes hear people arguing that freedom is morally important because people know their own lives better, epistemic access, yada, yada, yada. And therefore, we should give people freedom because they'll make good options for themselves. But if you think about it really, that doesn't actually track, right? Because if you think that the reason why we should give people freedom to make their own choices is because their freedom will lead to good outcomes, then the important thing was those outcomes, right? If you think that the reason you should give people freedom is because it will allow them to lead to more happiness, then the thing you actually care about is happiness. And then you can just respond to that by saying, look, even if in general it's a good idea to give people a little bit more freedom so that they can, make good options where the state can't because of lack of information. In this specific instance, that's unlikely to be the case because fake news, populism, etc., or maybe this is something that's specifically technocratic and relies on a specific level of technical or situational know-how or knowledge or expertise to make those decisions. And so you can just reject it on those fronts. So even if someone does justify that freedom claim, the kind of individual like epistemic moral claim, right, where you're saying like it's moral because people know for themselves what's best, that's the really easy objection to that there. So that second objection there will still work, even if there's been a little bit more justification for that point than you would otherwise expect. Okay, so that's one set of objections. The second set of objections we're going to look at is examples where you're arguing for something, where a team is arguing for something that's intuitively bad, but is nonetheless made legitimate or morally good because it's democratic. So, for example, this could be motions about voting to go to war, or motions about voting to destroy the climate, or voting in really bad parties, where they're like, look, we get the outcome is something that you might be dubious about, but we have to follow the democratic will. So these are the ways in which you would object to that. You can just say, look, democracy is not a sufficient condition to legitimate something morally. So just because something is democratic doesn't mean that it is morally imperative. And these are the objections you would do there. So first set is that you would say, one second. Yeah, so first is that the vote doesn't sufficiently restore the freedom that's taken from it, right, which is intuitive. If I'm opposed to every law the government implements, I don't think the fact that I visited a voting booth changes the fact that they were imposing laws which restrict my freedoms. Like if you take like I don't know, take your favorite US state that's like about 3 weeks away from implementing a law for like hunting down and killing trans people, right? Like Florida is basically about 3 weeks away from doing that. I don't think it's intuitive that just because it's been voted for means it's a good thing in those instances, right? I think it's really easy to come up with some strong objections to that. And a good intuition point for that is if 5 people come up to me in the street, beat the hell out of me, take all of my money, take my watch. I don't wear a watch, but if they took my watch and those kinds of things, just because 5 out of the 6 people wanted to do it doesn't mean it was a good thing to do. So I think you can say here is that this is not a sufficient restoration of your freedom or a sufficient kind of freedom. I mean, you could object to this on the other end and say that, well, even in a non-democratic system, that kind of thing could happen. But it's basically, you can use it to justify some kind of extended democratic protections. Or, for example, anarchism. You could use it as a way to justify anarchism. If you have, say, if you could argue that there's a communalistic morality that comes from anarchism, that means you don't end up with these kinds of situations, and you can have organic emergent decision making or that kind of thing. It could be things like extended protest rights or right to platforming, for example. So I could say that, like, look, because under a democracy, I can still be outvoted by people that want me dead. Actually, through freedom and democracy, is being allowed to voice your opinions as much as possible so that you can have the opportunity to persuade those people away from their positions, which you would not have in the absence of democracy, for example. And that could be an argument against banning people on Twitter or something like that. That's one way of doing it, basically saying that the vote is not actually a sufficient restoration of freedom, or even if it restores your freedom to the extent that it existed in the state of nature, it could be better. And we think that freedom is good, so we want more of it. We think self-governance is good, etc. Second one is that the citizens of a state are not the only people whose freedom is restricted by its laws. So this implies that it's not sufficient for a country to vote for something in order to legitimate that act morally. So, for example, if a particular country decides to go to war, if Ireland decides to go to war with Japan, Just because Ireland voted for that, that doesn't mean that it's like good, because it implies that you might harm some people from a different country who didn't have a choice to vote in that election to bring in those leaders who were war hungry and wanted to go to war. Similarly, you can make the argument for climate related policies that it affects animals who don't have the right to vote, or different countries who are still affected by your carbon emissions. Immigration law, for example, is another way about arguing for that. And another, of course, way you could argue for these things, if you wanted to give an even further objection, is that because of the birth lottery, it's arbitrary that you're born outside of a particular country. So it's arbitrary that that person is given a right to decide its actions more than you, especially given the fact that you're still influenced by the actions of that country. You can also use it to argue for future generations as well, who might be affected by things like climate change or currently existing policies. And you could even intuit what those people might have voted for and argue, and argue as a flip of the principle that this would be, in fact, the opposite, right? Because these groups of people meet the sufficient conditions outlined by the other team as to when you should be allowed to decide something within a governmental issue. And so if we infer what those people would want, and deduce that it is in fact opposite to the other group, or to the other team in the motion, is in fact supports your side, you have now found, in line with the other side's argument, a democratic justification for your argument. So this not only works as an objection, but also as a flip for the arguments in a lot of instances. Third objection then is that voting does not restore people's freedom. So if freedom is the right to make decisions which align with your preferences, there's a number of ways in which you could argue that voting is not sufficient. One could be technocracy. So as I said earlier, you could have specific knowledge requirements to know what the particular outcome of a policy might be. And if you can argue, and you need to specifically argue this, that people's preferences are outcome-based. So people don't necessarily want, people don't care about economic plan A, B, or C in a kind of means-based way. What they care about is reducing unemployment, reducing inflation, increasing wages, increasing general prosperity, having more businesses around, having better public services, etc. And if those are particular outcomes that people want, what you can do is you can challenge the intuition that the vote is the best way to arbitrate how you can get towards those outcomes. And if you could argue, say we would return to the stuff in the ballot box example, yes, people might want this party to be in power, but the reason why they think that is because of fake news or populism or lies, etc., which have convinced those people that that group is the group that is going to lead to a particular set of outcomes. But if we can objectively explain to you why the objective outcomes that they want are better approximated by rejecting their vote or not allowing them to vote, then we actually restore their freedom more, because we allow them to live in a world closer to their conception of the good than the world in which they are allowed to vote, right? So that's another way you could object to that. Now it's going to go into a set of other objections that might be a little bit more circumstantial, but are interesting. First is, as I kind of hinted earlier, if you just justify utilitarianism, then nothing in the state power principle matters, except to the extent that it results in happiness. There's probably other moral frameworks which allow you to do this as well. But if you just justify an alternative moral framework, particularly non-deontological ones, you're going to be just in a situation where nothing in the state power principle matters, right? Because if you can fully justify that the only thing that's morally important is happiness, then freedom doesn't matter and reciprocity doesn't matter, so the state power principle doesn't matter. This kind of obviates the principle, like it just makes it redundant and kind of moot. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward, but it is something that you can just do. I think people sometimes forget that they can just do this. Like if you just give if you just respond to the principle by saying like, okay, their argument relies on deontological moral value associated with freedom and the restoration of freedom via reciprocity when it's been taken away from people. I'm just going to give 3 reasons why I think utilitarianism is true, which will thus therefore explain why their principle does not stand. Firstly, secondly, thirdly, yada, yada, yada. Straightforward. Second, this is a bit of a flip. Also, to be clear, this other objection section aren't specific to like either democracy is insufficient or is too sufficient, but it's just kind of other things you can use in different rounds to object to the state power principle, or to discuss it or embolden it in certain ways. One is you have an obligation to democracy. You can say that the state gives you quite a lot, right? Safety, protection, privacy, good life, roads, hospitals, libraries, etc., that you wouldn't have without the state. And so you've been a net beneficiary of the state. Therefore, you owe the state something in return, right? So that could be used to justify things like conscription, mandatory voting, high rates of taxation, etc. The objection to this that you normally hear is what's called the book thrower analogy, who I can't remember who came up with it. It might have been Nozick, I'm not sure. But it's basically the idea that if you, if I have a book worth $5 and I throw it in your window and you take the book and you read the book and you enjoy the book, and I knock on your door and ask you for $5 for that book, you don't really have an obligation to give me those $5 because you weren't consulted as to whether or not you wanted that book in the first place. So the objection to this objection would then go as follows. It does not matter that the state gives you certain good things and your life is theoretically better than it would be outside of the existence of the state, because you were never given a choice. Obviously, we discussed some objections to that objection earlier, and we talked about the idea of hypothetical consent and that kind of thing. But an alternative, objection to the objection would be actually to just say that the state doesn't have the ability to give you a choice, because the state can either exist or not exist. And in that situation, it ought to defer to the option which it reckons most people will want. And so the option between existing or not existing, wherein under one of those systems you have extremely good lives, or in the other system you don't, you should choose the first one. And that doesn't make irrelevant the good things that the state has done for you, because it also could have not done those things for you. I don't want to get too into the weeds on that, but you can see how you can kind of work back and forth in these over the course of like a few speeches or an entire debate. Third one is rights. If something is a right and you've justified it as being a right, then a democratic process shouldn't legitimize the removal of that right, because you can weigh the right as being more important. So you could say, if you argue that the right to privacy is really important, and someone argues that democracy is important, and so people that vote for more CCTV cameras should be respected. If you just argue for your right better and explain why your right is more important, then you don't need to deal with the democratic question, because certain rights are important irrespective. Example of this is you could say democracy is predicated on the equal validity of contributions from each person, right? Because the idea of democracy is that every person should have an equal say. Therefore, the overriding principle from which democracy draws its strength is the principle of equality. Consequently, any justifications of democracy in general also justify the protection of rights related to equality, even if people want to vote away those rights, right? So, for example, you could say, say if it was a motion about, well, you would never get this motion, but hypothetically, a motion about discrimination, where it was a motion about, banning gay marriage, actually be a great example. Even if proposition argued that this was a popular policy that most people would want, what you could say is the only basis of justification for why we should follow the democratic will is a belief fundamentally in equality. However, equality necessarily in this instance would imply that you should have equal access to marriage for all people, regardless of ascriptive characteristics, which are arbitrary in the sense that people are born into them or born into the circumstances which kind of cause them to be that way. This is kind of a little bit, you'd be getting in the weeds a little bit with this one. But if you get what I mean, this is the kind of stuff that would make for a very elegant whip speech. Because if you just do this kind of thing, like the kind of, well, take your principle, take our principle, and see where they meet in the middle, like look at where the premises interact with one another, and solve any of the conundrums that result from that. And that could be done by weighing, it could be done by logic, as just done there. You're just going to be in a better situation. And it's a really nice speech to listen to, in my opinion, those kinds of speeches. And really fun to do as a kind of like logical exercise. And they're very efficient to do. So you don't need to give 7 responses to a principle, to the state power principle, if you can just do this. Notably, as I was saying earlier, this is kind of a solution to the question of the group violence thing. Remember I said earlier the example where 5 people beat up a 6th person. This is a reason why that you can argue why that is actually still illegitimate in those instances. So it can be used to justify minority rights here. Similar logic can be used to justify protections against democratic backsliding. Although the most simple version of that is just like, if democracy is good, you want democracy to exist for as long as possible. So it might need specific protections to maintain its existence over a long period of time, right? The argument you generally hear, you generally hear that argument about free speech. Is the argument for why you would, for example, have laws against hate speech. Is that even if free speech is good, you might need to put restrictions on certain kinds of speech to ensure that most free speech exists in the future. Similar objection could be given to protections that are anti-democratic but prevent democratic backsliding. Okay, fourth one would be the Rawlsian option, which would be just, you could say that morality or freedom, good, whatever, freedom from coercion is a world in which everyone will be happy with how the world is, or the state of affairs, the distribution of resources, the kinds of laws that existed, the institutions, etc. If they thought it was good, even if they didn't know who they were going to be in that world, or who they were in that world. So, i.e., under the veil of ignorance, how would they set up society? If I was, a bird in the sky, and I knew that I actually am one of those people on the ground, but I don't know which one I am, would I be happy with the way that the world is set up? An intuition for this that's good is if someone puts a gun to your head and says, your money or your life, right? You're given an option between you die or you give them all your money. Theoretically, this is a free choice, right? Because you've got two options that are equally available to you, and they're not preventing you from taking either of those two options. But you're in fact not free, because you don't have the freedom to choose the conditions under which you made the choice, right? So that, even though that is an example of a free choice between two things, you could argue that it's still wrong, because the person with the gun wouldn't want to be given those two options if they were the person that did not have the gun, or they wouldn't have offered those conditions if they were not the one that had the gun, etc. This would be a very strong justification for any minority rights within democracy, which is that you could say, look, even if 70% of people voted for a policy that completely messed with 30% of people, they would not have voted for that policy if they were that 30% of people. And there's an arbitrariness as to who we are in those circumstances. And so we cannot just defer to the democratic model and the kind of majoritarian democratic model in this instance, and need specific protections for these groups. Fifth one, this is the hammers. I think this is Joseph Lewis came up with this. You can see him doing it in the Doxbridge World semi-final, which is about the legitimacy of the state, which basically just someone offers you 5 hammers that they were going to hit you on the head with, and some were big and some were small, and some had like shiny bells, etc. Some had like really nice colors. That choice isn't a free choice, because choice within a fixed set of constrained options isn't actually free. Free choice isn't, consultation is not choice. And this could be generalized. You could say the hypothetical conditions under which democracy could make things legitimate haven't actually been realized, don't actually exist under any actual democratic system. You could also use this to justify, for example, things like liquid democracy or blind democracy, or direct democracy, actually, would be the kind of intuitive justification of this. But it's one objection that you can use for a couple of different ways. Sixth one, this is a bit more abstract, but it is kind of fun. I don't know how you would use this, but there's basically the idea of like the conception of democracy that we have in debates, where it's like one person has their freedom taken away from them, and their rational self-governance, and if that person commits a crime, that person is sent to prison, and only they are sent to prison, and no one else is sent to prison. And it's fine because they, as an individual, had the choice to vote as to whether or not that law existed. There's some objections you could have to that kind of thing, based off of a more communal or interpersonal understanding of the self. So, for example, the World's Final on Ubuntu philosophy. Ubuntu would be a system of philosophy which kind of has a slightly more interpersonal ontology of the self, right? The kind of I am because we are thing is kind of, I think, more deep than you saw in the World's Final, where it's not just the ethical claim, it's the ontological claim. It's that we literally are because others are. So there's kind of a more communal identity there. At least that's my understanding of it. And there's a bunch of different other versions of or similar kind of metaphysical perspectives that would imply some problems with the state power principle. I don't know how frequently this would be viable as an argument, but it's something you certainly could do. Similarly, though, and this is probably the easier version of the objection to the kind of rational individual agent conception of democracy, is that it causes us to extricate ourselves from our ascriptive characteristics, right? And it might not allow, theoretically, even for things like descriptive representation, right? So, a Black American voting for a Black candidate is actually hard to justify under the state power principle as you generally see it. There's ways of doing it, right? You could argue that that person is on aggregate likely to advance their interests, and therefore it's fine for them to vote for them. But this would certainly be a strong objection. This kind of objection here is a strong objection to things like blind democracy, where you just like write down what policies you like and it decides who you vote for. Because you can say that, like, well, actually, our conceptions of the good aren't actually extricated from the material conditions under which we live, and our ascriptive characteristics can inform our perspectives on the world in which we live and that kind of thing. It's one way of arguing, anyways, and it's, I think, an interesting way to take an objection because it brings it back into a kind of more social dynamic rather than a philosophical dynamic, which could be useful if you happen to already be running a kind of sociological case. But I can count on one hand the number of times I've made these arguments, so they're not that frequently useful, in my opinion. 7 is the why are you talking about objection. So a lot of people, as I mentioned earlier, just run the state power principle as they learned it off from whoever they learned it from, with actually very little consideration of what they're actually saying. Meaning two things. Firstly, people oftentimes will literally forget to cover all of the premises. So don't tune out when they start speaking, because if they miss a step, they haven't proven anything. And you can say, well, look, they didn't make that argument. You cannot credit them for something they didn't say. And secondly, means a lot of the contexts it's used in don't actually follow logically. So you could argue that taxation policy, or probably more intuitively, educational policy, might not really be a law which restricts your freedom. Like, it's what freedom is it restricting there? I'm not sure. And you can just call teams out on that, right? Like, if the whole point is that the state power principle is based off the breaking of laws, you can just say, like, well, no one would have done this anyway, so it doesn't matter. And the eighth, and this the really interesting one, is just basic weighing, because under the principle, you could argue that an undemocratic law, the actual harm of it, if you don't follow the principle, is the threat of violence, coercion, towards specific groups of people who otherwise would have done that thing that is now illegal. But in extreme cases, you could just say that your impact is bigger, right? You could just say, look, we've proven that implementing this law will cause thousands of deaths. And we think that that is more important than the hypothetical subset of society who is constrained in their options of what they can do based off of implementing the law or whatever. This objection, I think, theoretically it works, and especially if the principle has been poorly argued for, because if they don't actually deal with a lot of these strong versions of the policy, then you end up in a situation where this kind of weighing can really work. But in my opinion, generally speaking, I think that judges tend to not credit this response very highly, at least in my experience. But so sometimes they do, right? And I've been in debates before where it has worked. But it's an option that's available to you. And especially if you can really hammer it home, the fact that, like, okay, there is like 5 people in this country who would have actually done the thing that we're making illegal. And yes, those 5 people are now being coerced by the threat of violence. But those 5 people would have killed 20,000 people if they had been allowed to do this thing. And so we cannot, it is unethical fundamentally to implement this law. So that's the kind of basic idea of that. Okay, so basically what that has shown then is likely going to be sufficient for most uses of the state power principle. Because if you're a team that doesn't tend to run principles too often, this should be sufficient for, in my opinion, for most ways to either turn the state power principle into utilitarianism, so you can win with your utilitarian argument, or call out some problems with the state power principle, which you can fill in with your case, or turn your utilitarian case into a principled case via response. One thing I want to note, though, is that obviously these objections, they are, it's not like economics, right, or like regular political arguments and debates where like you can just take 3 responses to one point and that one point is out of the debate. All these things are exposing problems with the state power principle and what they're saying as it is generally run. And what they're saying, each of them, is that there is something which this principle does not take into account, and any system of morality that does not take this thing into account is an insufficient, improper, or incomplete system of morality. But that means that you need to show that your thing does in fact take this problem into account and solves it in a more material way, or in a better way, or a more persuasive way, more certain way, etc. What that therefore means is that you shouldn't just randomly choose one of these things, or 2 or 3 of these things to respond to an argument with, but it's just a tool that means you can put it at the end of your case or as part of your point to argue that your principle or your argument does in fact cover the ground that the state power principle as it is generally run does not, right? So I guess what I'm saying here is you need to be able to think critically about these things as you're employing them, but they are useful tools in my opinion. What we're going to cover next then, and this will be the last or the remainder of the workshop, is how can you run the state power principle? Can it be improved, or can it be alternatively formulated in ways that avoid some of the problems that we've been discussing? Now, as a note beforehand, I'm just going to give mostly ideas for this next section, and I'll leave the kind of formulation of it to yourself. These are just things you can argue for, and you can think of in prep time the reasons why it's true. Not all of these things are going to respond to each of those objections, and many of them really don't respond to the objections. So what is, I guess, the idea of this is that you shouldn't just have one state power principle available to you that you run and hope that the other teams won't give the proper responses to it. But it should be a situation whereby within the particular motion and position that you're in, you can choose a formulation of the state power principle that best deals with the likely objections you'll hear to it in the round, or the potential objections that could exist to it in the round, in such a way as to insulate yourself against the risk of response. So these are just some options available to you, and none of them are necessarily better than the other. Each of them is going to be selectively valuable given the context of the round. First one is don't run the state power principle. And this might seem a little bit facetious, and it kind of is, or not facetious, sarcastic. But basically, oftentimes it is a good idea to just not run the state power principle, because there's a lot of different principles that exist that people just never use, but are really good, right? Instrumentalization is a great principle. Privacy is a great principle. Bodily autonomy is a great principle. All these things are things that are really good to justify, and no one knows how to respond to it because people don't run it very frequently. And so generally, when you're defending something in a debate, the state power principle is a proxy justification. You're saying that this thing, this end, or this phenomenon is good because we voted for it, or we would vote for it if given the option. Instead, if you really want to run a principle, just argue that the thing is good in that direct way, and not argue by, going through the additional step of the state power principle. So why is privacy good, or why is war bad, will oftentimes be a better argument in a lot of situations. And you can really just run those things by thinking in prep, okay, can I think of 3 good reasons why privacy is important? Either utilitarianly, like instrumentally important, or philosophically important. And you'll be in a pretty good situation then to have either a case or specifically a principled case for that side of the motion. Second option is, I call it I promise it's not utilitarianism option, but it's basically, you could argue that democracy almost always leads to better outcomes than non-democracy. And you can either just leave it at that. You can directly refer to that as like inferential reasoning. Like X is normally right, therefore X is probably right in this situation. Although I find that judges almost never like allow for that kind of deduction in debates. Like it's a really rare form of analysis. I suppose there's a plausible interpretation of the World's Manual that says it's you can't do that analysis because it could be like an appeal to authority. But the more interesting way to do this is rule utilitarianism, right? So you'd say democracy generally leads to better outcomes than non-democracy. We should act in accordance with the rule that generally leads to best outcomes. Therefore, we should act democratically. You would obviously need to justify each of these premises. And I think this is unlikely to work without some other material to support your point. So this can work really well as weighing, right? Like if they've said, well, this is going to lead to some negative consequences, and you say, well, it's going to lead to some good consequences, and maybe we're not sure whether it will lead to good or bad consequences, which means we should defer to this rule that shows that generally this will lead to better consequences as like a weighing metric. Although theoretically, if you've just fully justified these three claims, you don't need any other material to justify your claim that you should follow the democratic will. They will be sufficient on this alone. Third option is the epistemic justification. So this is basically Korsgaard's constructivism. I don't know if she uses it explicitly to support democracy, but it tends to be just a kind of argument you'll hear a lot in debates. It's one of the more popular principles, and you can just use it to justify democracy. So value doesn't exist abstractly, only when the human will wills it to be so. Therefore, a fair democratic process is one in which we can collectively consider, discuss, and will our conception of the good into reality. And like that fair democratic process would be a priori moral. That would be the ethical outcome, like in and of itself, because the definition of what it means to be ethical under this system is that which we have collectively considered and arbitrated as being ethical, which means that as long as we do this collective process of consultation, decision making, etc., and discussion, the result of it will be the right outcome. This would only work for some kinds of democratic arguments. So, for example, this wouldn't work for a state power principle based argument where you're saying that, well, if we happened to poll everyone in the country right now, this is what they would vote for, because you haven't gone through that process of deliberating. But it would work for some other things. So it's an option you have available to you. It's really strong. Theoretically, it's a very, very strong principle because of the fact that the outcome is like a priori the right thing to do, based off the reasoning employed by the principle. Obviously, you can respond to this in one of the ways I was saying earlier. If free will doesn't exist, then this argument, it is hard to argue that it exists. And there's ways around that, right? You could say that, like, even if free will doesn't exist, human will exists. And, even if by the act of, like, say, experiencing the world, that just happens to give me a set of wills for that world, that doesn't mean that those wills aren't morally important. So, for example, if I drink an energy drink, and I experience that as being tasty, valuable, and good, then I'm willing energy drinks to be valuable in the world. And that doesn't necessarily rely on that will being free, but just that it exists. You get into some really, really murky and abstract philosophical territory then. But basically what I'm saying here is that it doesn't necessarily need to be the case that this argument actually relies on free will existing. And you can respond to that objection if you get it. This response, the free will doesn't exist response, I think I saw a debate before where Hamza gives this response and calls someone, I think, old-fashioned for using it because, I think Darian once used this argument a few times. Oh, yeah, famously in the Oxford IV's final 2017. This is the argument you hear in the DPM speech. But basically that objection to it, the kind of like meta level objection, is something you can actually definitely evade if you want to. Fourth, this is my favorite way of running the state power principle. It's the one that's most intuitive to me. Is that the property and the power of the state, so like its tax money, its army, its legal system, etc., is how the state does stuff, right? Like all the things that the state does, it does based off of property and power. And because no one person has a stronger claim to the property and power of the state than any other person, because of the birth lottery or because, I don't know, property is legitimate. Take your favorite philosophical or Marxist approach here and add it to that second principle or second premise to justify it. Resultingly, each person has an equal claim to the property and power of the state because no one has a stronger claim than anyone else. So everyone's claim to it must be therefore equal. Therefore, each person has an equal claim to what the state does with its property and power, therefore democracy, right? So it's basically that it's like the Leviathan, right? The we are the Leviathan, we are the state. Every single person is the state. And so the question of what should the state do is the question of what should every single person do. So, or what does every single person want to do or think is the right thing to do, etc. So this is pretty good in some instances because it doesn't rely on any freedom being really taken away from you, because this can be true even if the state is good and even if good things exist because of states. And there's problems with this as well, and objections you could make to it. But as is true for each of these options, each of these options for alternative formulations of the principle have benefits and harms, potential objections that others don't have, potential strong suits that others don't have, that you should be choosing between based off of the specific situation that you find yourself in within the round, or more generally, which one people are better responding at. So maybe even if all of them have 4 hypothetical objections to them, if one of them has a bunch of hypothetical objections that no one actually ever uses or no one thinks of, then that is, in reality, it's materially the best one to use because no one gives the responses that, even that if those responses hypothetically exist, right? Option 5, bit of a boring one, but in the absence of democracy, there's no mechanism by which people can think of interests between groups as mutually exclusive or as not mutually exclusive, right? So if we don't have democracy, I think my neighbors are my enemy. I think that the country beside me is one. Actually, that's a poor example. I think that the next town across is my enemy, or that group of people who live in the other part of the city are my enemy, because the advancement of their interests is mutually exclusive with the advancement of my interests, which leads to conflict, strife, those kinds of things. Democracy uniquely allows for a conception of a collective good, because we can vote together for the overall outcome, solve collective action problems, maybe, etc. So democracy is good. This is kind of a weird one because it's like partially principled and partially kind of consequential, but it's a decent one, and it works for more hypothetical debates about democracy. If you want to find a good justification for democracy in the abstract that doesn't rely on the taking away of freedoms and the restoration of them. Option 6 is kind of a more defined version of the previous one, is to do with collective action. Basically, like in the absence of rule of law, our freedom is restricted by the fact that we can't trust one another. Therefore, rule of law allows for the formation of a society in which people are more free, right? Because I can rely on you to not steal my stuff, which gives me freedom, even if it means that I can't steal your stuff. The overall amount of freedom I get is more substantial. Therefore, we are more free because of democracy. This can be used as an objection to the state power principle, but can also be used as a way to form the state power principle as well. This is the Rousseau argument, right? People are forced to be free within democracy. Option 7 then, and this is the final option, is just run the state power principle, right? I mean, like this is a better, I think, slightly better formation of the principle, but it's basically what people are mostly doing most of the time. Each person has an intrinsic right to self-governance. The right to self-governance is restricted by the imposition of laws on people. The right to self-governance is sufficiently restored by democracy. Therefore, each person has an intrinsic right to democracy. This is a coherent, like, syllogism. That argument is sound, as long as you justify each of those premises. So if you have to, just think of the reasons why each of those 3 claims is true, and then you have a full principle. And you can find creative or new or distinct ways of doing each of the justifications for those premises, but it does sufficiently prove that democracy is something that people have a right to. You don't even really need part of the 3rd premise, right? You don't even really need to say that the right to self-governance is sufficiently restored by democracy. You can just say that it's in part restored by democracy, and that gets you some of the way there, right? Because if you take away $1,000 from me and burn $800, you should still give me back the $200 other dollars. That would leave you in a trickier situation depending on what you're using the principle for, of course. So the sufficiency claim in the 3rd premise is something that you can leave out depending on whether or not it's important for your argument. But this overall argument here is that you can do, as long as you just justify each of the claims. And there's good reason to believe each of those 3 claims. And a good way of just arguing for it is not deferring to the way you've heard it run before or what you heard in a workshop, but just thinking, okay, like take it like you would a practical argument. I need to prove these 3 things so that the conclusion is true. how can I prove these things, and how can I prove them in such a way that the objections I would likely hear to it, the responses that I'd likely hear to it, won't land. So you might think, okay, the right to self-governance is restricted by the imposition of laws, premise 2. Okay, well, maybe a team might say that imposing laws actually is, allows for freedom for people. Well, I'll preempt that by proving it in this particular way, which prevents that response from landing, that kind of thing. That should all be sufficient to prove the overall point. And yeah, I guess the overall thing that I'm saying in this section then is just that you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The fact that the state power principle has some flaws and some problems in its general normal formulation doesn't mean you need to get rid of it. Just that there's ways of improving it very slightly to hedge against the potential objections that you might hear to it. So I guess all that I have written down for the kind of this session, but I guess the overall takeaways are as follows. Firstly, the state power principle isn't just some things that people are saying really quickly in debates, but they are arguments, and they should be treated as arguments in debates. And the way you can treat it as an argument is first, there's a number of responses that you can give to it, depending on the case that you're running, that will point out the insufficiencies of how people generally run it. And secondly, there's a number of different ways that you can formulate the state power principle that will prevent some of those objections from being relevant or impactful. And thirdly, even if you don't want to run an alternative version of the state power principle, you should give the actual state power principle that you're running a little bit more time and consideration to make sure that you are in fact justifying the premises within it, and that will lead you in a pretty good situation within a particular debate. So overall then, I think, the main takeaway is just state power principle. It's good sometimes, it's bad sometimes. You can make it better by running it better, and you can make it, worse by responding to it, right? You can make it a less strong argument for other teams by being considerate of how you can respond to it. Cool. Okay, that's all I have.